Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Agile Made Easy. My name is Renee Alanis. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager here at TechExcel. TechExcel is really proud to host our 2014 webcast series. We've been holding informative webinars on various topics about once a month throughout the year. So be sure to check out our events page at techexcel.com to see when the next webinar is. And today we'll also announce the part 2 of today's Agile webinar. You can be sure to follow our product managers on Twitter. Our DevSuite product manager is just at DevSuitePM, so DEVSUITEPM. And be sure to follow them for the latest information and tips. Now, a little logistics. I encourage all of you to use the question function. It's located at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Just type in your question, and we will answer them at the end of today's discussion. And if for some reason we run out of time, we will follow up with you personally. We also plan to conduct a poll today. Once the poll is launched, you'll be able to just click your answer in the poll tab, and then we'll review the results. Today's webinar is being recorded, so we will send out a link to the recording to all attendees after the presentation, along with a white paper on Agile best practice tips. Now I'd like to introduce TechExcel's product manager, Vineet Arwal. Welcome, Vineet.
Thanks, Renee. Welcome, everyone, to the part 1 of the 3-part webinar series. In today's webinar, we'll specifically focus on how to implement Agile techniques in your team and how to build better software. Agile, we'll particularly focus on the best practices that we have gained as a software vendor, and the best practices that we use in our development teams, and how we implement Agile methodology. These best practices are we have gained based on our past experiences and also based on our current experiences. And also, we'll provide you some of the insights on how we actually transitioned from a traditional development methodology into the Agile development methodology, and how we actually gained these, best practices. Also, our Agile development tool, which is DevTrack, all these best practices have been adopted in those tools as well, and then you can easily see when you use that tool that how these best practices come into reality, and how you can easily implement Agile development for your team using DevTrack, and how you can hit the ground running from the day one since you start the project. Once I'm done with the webinar, at the end I'll take up some questions, and then we'll do a quick interactive session using the question and answer session as well. So let's start with the agenda, and let's see the 4 main points that we're going to cover throughout this webinar. I'll dig into the details of each of these points and specifically share some of the important aspects of Agile methods and how we at TechExcel implement those methods as well. So we'll talk about the user stories. We'll talk about what is a user story and what are the different methods to estimate the user story, and then how to actually implement the user story. Then we'll see how to manage the user story in the product backlog. What are the different kinds of product backlogs, and why do we need 2 or 3 different backlogs as well. Next, we're going to focus on the planning piece. So once we have defined what the user story is, once we have stored the user story, then the next step is to actually plan for those user stories so that we can go ahead and implement those user story and make it as part of the product. So we'll see the different aspects of release planning and also different aspects of sprint planning as well. The last topic in this webinar would be about the implementation, wherein our core focus would be how to enable team communication, how to enable open communication, because using that it actually increases the efficiency of the team, and then it enables communication, and issues get resolved much quicker than just having it to use, just instead of using a simple tool. So let's start with the user story. And let's see, we'll go through the three main aspects of user story. One is how to define a crisp user story, what is a good user story, what is a bad user story, and then we'll see how to estimate a user story. And lastly, we'll also see some of the implementation methods of user stories and how we recommend or what are the best practices to use the user stories. Any user story contains three vital pieces of information. It has the user persona, which basically describes who is going to be the user who's going to use that particular feature. The next piece is the objective of the user story. Basically why, what's the purpose of that feature, and then the last is the why, which is basically why would someone use this feature, in what scenario, and in what other use cases. So any user story containing these three pieces of information can be called a good user story. And just because a user story has these three information, it will make sense to both the stakeholders, that is the external users, and also to the engineers. So for example, we have a user story saying that a product manager should be able to check in and check out the document so that there are no conflicts while editing the document, right? So this is just an example which says that, okay, my user is going to be a product manager. The objective is to check in and check out the document, and why would someone use this feature, so that there are no conflicts while editing the documents. And now when the external user is reading it, he really knows that, okay, whether this particular sentence satisfies my request or not. And for the engineers, they really know that, okay, now we need to implement this user story, and then they can estimate based on that. The other aspect of the user story is that it can also be a part of a larger epic. By epic, I mean that, let's say if there is a big product, and a big product actually is broken down into multiple smaller components. So let's say a smaller component could be reporting, the other component could be tracking, the other component could be just assigning tasks. So each of those components can then be called a user story or a small feature in there, and it could be part of a larger epic. We'll cover the epics in detail in the part two of our webinar, and then we'll see how we can scale the user stories and the requirements management using in the Agile framework. The next piece in the user story is the estimation of the user story. So the important piece to remember in estimation is that especially estimation for the user story, should always focus on the size and not the duration. So and the estimation could be based on different methods. So it's basically estimated in terms of points. Now those assigning of the points could be either using some standard methods like Fibonacci series or planning poker or some of the other methods, but we at TechExcel adopted a much simpler approach, and we estimate a user story in terms of simple points like 10, 20, 30, and that describes the size of the user story. The larger the number, the more weightage that user story has. So once the user story has been estimated, then comes the part of how do you actually implement that user story. So in terms of implementation of the user stories, our development team takes a little different approach, and we feel that we believe that this approach is much more useful, and it's much more flexible in terms of tracking the user story and implementing it. So basically, we break down each of the user story into implementable or executable tasks, and in terms of the tasks, we actually, instead of estimating the task in terms of points, we estimate it in number of hours. And I'll tell you the reason why we chose to estimate in terms of hours versus the points when we go to the planning piece, and you'll yourself see the difference and the benefits of doing so. Also, the other reason of breaking down a user story into tasks is that with the task, the ownership is clearly defined, and once all the tasks are complete for that user story, then the user story can be marked complete. So it's really easier to manage and easier to track the implementation of the user story. Let's move on to the next piece in this topic, that is the backlog. So in Agile development, if you see, there is a very common term used is the product backlog. But if you see, by definition, product backlog is really a simple warehouse for all the user stories and bugs that need to be implemented and fixed across multiple releases. Right, so it's just a simple, it's a huge warehouse containing the entire list, but then that list needs to be broken down into a list which can be executed or which can be implemented for a specific release or for a specific sprint. So based on our experience, we also initially had a single backlog, and then we use that backlog to populate our sprints as well. But then we realized that just going through that entire backlog takes a lot more time than just a lot more time for assigning populating the sprints. So we decided to have another backlog called as the release backlog. So now it becomes really easier for our product teams and for our engineering managers to have a release backlog wherein for every specific release, we have a release backlog. We use the release backlog for for road mapping some of the features. So it's just an additional filter. We take the features from product backlog, assign it to the release backlog, and then from the release backlog, we assign it to the sprints as well. So you will see that how the three different backlogs are beneficial when I'm talking about the planning piece. But before I move on to planning, just quickly would like to point out is both the release backlog and the sprint backlog would contain both user stories and bugs that need to be implemented in the sprints or in the releases, because bugs is also an important part of the release, because let's say there are some of the bugs that have been discovered or that have been reported in the previous releases. Those need to be fixed in the next release, so that is why release backlog and sprint backlog need to be a mixture of both both bugs and user stories. Let's move on to see the planning. So just a quick recap. We talked about the user stories and how to define those user stories, how to estimate the user stories. Then we saw that how to actually store those user stories in the different backlog. Now is the time wherein we would actually plan for the user stories, and we would start populating, assigning those user stories from the main product backlog, from a larger pool to release backlog, and then to the sprint backlog. So this planning piece would focus on two parts. One is the release planning, and then one is the sprint planning. So just a quick the reason why we have the release planning is, again, our products are broken down into multiple releases. So each of our release, basically in a single year, we have about 2 major releases and 2 minor releases. So we decided to have a release planning option there, and then to have a sprint planning option. So let's see some of the aspects of the release planning and some of the elements that release planning involves. So the first thing is that we before every release, like before I believe 2 weeks before the release starts, we have a release planning meeting wherein we start populating the release backlog. And as I mentioned earlier, this release backlog is populated using the product backlog. So when we are having this release planning, we take this opportunity to actually roadmap the user stories as well for each specific release, so that we can quickly prioritize the user stories for each of the releases. Once the user stories and bugs have been populated in the release backlog, we lock down the release backlog and we do not accept any new user stories once the release starts, so that this enables us to make sure that we are focused on implementing the user stories that we have committed for. Also, as mentioned, our release duration is about 3 to 4 months each, so that in a single year we could do 2 major releases and then 2 minor releases, which could be simple bug fix patches or minor feature improvements. The duration of the release, the 3 to 4 months of duration, is also based on our experience. So initially we started off having a 6-month release duration, but then we saw that there are some of the customers, some of our customers who want a new set of features before the 6-month duration as well. And then if there were any feedback or any changes required, then they had to wait for another 6 months for the next release. So we decided that let's shorten our release cycles and let's make it about 3 to 4 months each. So the biggest benefit that we gained is for our customers. The features that we implement in every release contains a mix of some of the customer enhancements and also some of the features that we push out to our customers, so that in the next month or so, when the customers roll out the new release, they realize that they need some more improvements or changes required, then we can immediately accommodate those changes in the next release and again push it out. So this really made the customers satisfied, because now they were receiving the features and improvements on a more frequent basis in a single year than just receiving it once. So once the release backlog has been populated, the next step in the planning process is the sprint planning. So basically, the sprint planning follows the same approach as the release planning, but it is purely focused on the specific sprint cycles. So before starting any sprint, we again have a sprint planning meeting, wherein we actually we populate the sprint cycles and the sprint backlog with the prioritized list of user stories. And also during the sprint planning meeting, we make sure that all the previous sprints are closed. We made that as a habit, and we suggest that as a best practice. The reason being is before you start any sprint, you have to make sure that the previous sprint is closed, so that there are no leaks and no gaps in the features, because we realize that if we leave the previous sprint open, then there were some bugs. Even if there are low priority or high priority bugs, we used to leave that in the previous sprint, and then none of the developers paid attention to the previous sprint, and then those bugs were those bugs actually crept in the actual product as well. So we decided that in the sprint planning meeting, we will close the previous sprint, and any user stories or any bugs that have not been fixed will be assigned to that release backlog, and then we'll again go to the common pool and will be ready to be assigned to the next sprint or next release, or whatever the case be. During the sprint planning meeting, after a lot of experiments in terms of how we should populate the sprint planning, either it should be based on a user stories basis or it should be based on purely task basis, we decided that the best approach is that you have a user story which makes sense to both the stakeholders and the engineering teams. So the best practice would be to actually break down the user stories into a set of individual tasks and assign ownership for each of those tasks. So if you notice, this is one of the screenshots from our DevTrack tool, which basically shows the sprint planning that we are sitting in the sprint planning meeting, and we have a set of user stories, that is the 17, 19, and 29. And each of these user stories, we break it down into further set of development tasks. These tasks actually could be either, you can call it as a set of checklist that is needed to be complete or finished in order to complete the user story. So we break it down into a set of tasks. Now, in terms of the planning, we estimate the user story in terms of the story points, but we estimate the task in terms of hours. So before I go ahead and talk about the estimation on as to why we choose story points versus task points, we have a poll question for you that we would like to get your feedback on, and then we'll show you that how at TechExcel we chose one approach over the other. So Renee, if you could help with the poll question. Okay, so looks like 34% of the audience, they use story points, 50% they use about time hours, and 10% task points, and 8% we don't estimate. So let's take this opportunity and let me just show you that how we use a combination of both story points and time hours to estimate our tasks and user stories, and how the how the other teams can also adopt this best practice in their team. So okay, so if you see, we have the story points, right? Story points are just indication of how big the feature would be and how not how much time would it take. In terms of how much time would it take, we have the individual tasks. So we break down the user story into tasks, and that's when we actually estimate. That's when we estimate each of the tasks in terms of the number of hours. The reason we use the number of hours is that when we are actually doing the sprint planning, when we are populating the sprints with the user stories and the bugs, so we can really use the number of hours and decide the workload for each sprint. So let's say if our the total number of or the estimated total for each for the total tasks is about like 80 hours or 160 hours or any number. So based on that, we could decide that okay, these set of user stories and these set of tasks would take about two sprints or one sprint or these number of days. So hours helps us to actually estimate the tasks accurately, and story points helps us to determine the size of the user story so that we can decide the priority of the user story and then assign it to a specific sprint. So, and also in terms of, since we follow the time hours, we can easily use these time hours to to generate our backlog reports, which I'll talk about in the next few slides. And it is really easier for the development teams to track their time, and also for the management team to track the daily progress of the sprints. In terms of the sprint duration, we, after a lot of thought and after a lot of experiences, we adopted the sprint duration to be 2 weeks. We started off with having a very aggressive schedule of just having 1 week of sprints, but then we realized that in this 1 week, even though the developers were able to implement the features, but we didn't have enough time for QA to run the tests and for any bug fixing. So we decided that let's try out a 3-week schedule. So but the 3-week of schedule was because of the 3 weeks, the number of sprints got reduced in a specific release, and because of that, somehow these sprints were being over allocated and were not being. Basically, it was not very efficient because of over allocation, and it just took longer. So we decided that 2-week sprints are optimum, because within 1 week time frame, our developers could implement the feature, and the next week we could utilize for any regression testing or any testing and for the bug fixing, so that after end of 2 weeks we can make sure that even if we are implementing a smaller piece, it does contribute to a larger product as well, and it's a working prototype of the it's basically a complete feature in itself. While we were breaking down the user stories into different tasks, we realized that every user task we were replicating the same for every user story, we were replicating the same set of tasks. So we implemented a specific feature in our tool which we call it as a quick add task. So every time you create a new user story, automatically a set of default tasks will automatically be created for those, so that, and also the default estimated total and the owner would automatically be defined, and this can all be template based, so that this made our sprint planning meetings more efficient, because now all we had to do is select the user stories that we want to implement in that sprint, and then automatically each of the user stories were broken down into the set of tasks, and the ownership was automatically assigned to those. And also, all we had to do is just adjust the estimated total for the tasks. So this feature really helped us. The other reason we added the option for quick task is to manage the spikes. So during our implementation, we realized that when we are researching on new features and new functionalities that we want to implement, or even if a new control or a new technology, then we realized that there are some user stories which are not very clear as to how they would be implemented, but still require the development time to actually execute, to do research those user stories. So when we are populating the sprint, we take into consideration both the set of user stories which are clearly defined and which have a clear set of tasks, and also we assign the user stories which are called spikes. And what we do is we create a dedicated task for that, and assign an owner who would do the research. But the biggest benefit of doing that is now the sprint the sprint cycle now contains both the executable user stories and tasks, and also some of the items that need research, and the resources and the time is still accounted for, even though it's just a research task. Okay, so we just talked about the quick add task, and this is a specific feature that we implemented based on our experience. And then when you use the DevTrack tool, you will also see the benefit of breaking down the user stories into different tasks. And also I will discuss the same benefit in our next slide, wherein we talk about the open communication and how these tasks benefit in the open communication as well. So let's move. So this is how the spikes are created. So in terms of implementation, let me just grab some water. Okay, sorry for that. In terms of implementation, our core focus of implementation was to improve the team communication. Because we realized that even though there is a tool which enables a custom workflow wherein you can use to push out the tasks to different owners, but that didn't really help to resolve the issues. So we realized that we need a way so that both the development team and the QA teams, and also sometimes the product management team, can get together, look at the set of tasks on a single board, and then discuss that, where we are lacking, what we need to do, and if there are any open issues, so we can immediately resolve that. So based on some of these experiences, we implemented some of the features in our tool, and that really enabled our teams to improve the communication, as well as our customers who are using the same tool. It helped their teams to improve the communication as well. So if you see, one part of the communication is the daily stand-up meetings. So basically, we have a daily stand-up meetings in which both the development team and the QA team particularly participates. It's just a 15 to 20 minutes team. We look at a large Agile board that we developed. It's part of the tool, DevTrack tool, and what we really do is we see the set of tasks owned by the developers. We see the set of tasks owned by the QA team. And also we look at specifically any bugs that have been reported by the QA team. Now the biggest benefit of having this meeting is that now the developers and QA team, they start talking. The QA team exactly knows that, okay, where this bug was reported on which particular task and who's the owner, so he can directly approach that specific developer and talk about and resolve any discrepancies between what was developed and what was being tested. So this all can be done within the 15 to 20 minutes time frame, and then the team can just keep moving forward and the issues are resolved in the start of the day itself, rather than realizing that there is an issue towards the end of the sprint. So we developed some of the tools in our DevTrack, some of the features in a DevTrack tool itself, which enables the team to conduct these daily Scrum meetings and keep the sprint rolling and keep the sprint moving by moving it through the different task statuses. One approach to daily stand-up meetings is looking at this Agile board. We call it as an Agile board. So what we do is we have a huge TV in our conference room. We just project it there. So with this, we already know that, okay, here are all the tasks that need to be implemented in sprint number 2. These are the owners. And now each owner can claim a set of tasks that he would be implementing in a particular on a particular day. And then would start working on that, and just using this same Agile board, the users or the developers can immediately update their time spent and time remaining as well, because we track the user stories in terms of tasks, and each task has been assigned a timeline as well. So that's how we calculate the percentage complete. So just within this, from this single view, now both developers and QA are working, and then in every daily meeting we make sure that the features that the developers had committed for on that specific day or on the previous day are implemented, have moved to either the QA state or to the done state. And if not, then we discuss what was the reason, if there are any roadblocks, and then we resolve those roadblocks, and so that the team can keep moving forward in the sprint cycle. Also, the other method of tracking or to track the progress of the team is using a simple list view. So basically, we use this list view to just see the total time spent, time remaining for each of the tasks. If you notice, each task has been assigned to a different owner, has a different state, and then has a different time spent, time remaining, which is basically populating the percentage complete. Now, the story is not complete unless all the tasks are complete. So that's why story represents a percentage roll-up of all the tasks underneath it. So just using this view, we can generate different reports from the system. Let's say we can generate a separate story list report with the percentage and distribute it to our customers, and so that they have an understanding that, okay, what they can expect out of the sprint or out of the release and how much it is complete. And also we can generate another report for the engineering managers, for the internal team, so that they can track the progress and they can see how much the tasks are complete, where are we lacking, and if we are going to make it on time for this particular sprint. Also, this view, the same view, the time spent and time remaining, also dictates the burn down reports as well, so that quickly using this, using this view, you can generate a quick burn down report for the sprints as well, so that you can really see how your team is progressing. The burn down report will again show you, and this is the burn down report from our tool itself. This will show you the total time spent, total time remaining, and it will also show you a projected end date, which is a very useful piece of information, because we understand that while you're running a sprint, it is possible that the sprint might have some delays as well. So the projected end date based on your performance shows that, okay, it just shows that when you can complete the sprint, so that you can take a call as to if you want to remove some of the features from the sprint, or if you want to add more resources to the sprint based on, basically you can do some decision making on that. So just a quick recap of what we just discussed in this webinar. We talked about the user stories, how they are, what the user stories, how they're going to be estimated, implemented. Then we talked about the backlog as to where, how we are going to store the user stories in different backlogs and when the different backlogs are useful. Then talked about the planning as to how to populate the release and the sprint cycles. And then we discussed how to actually enable the team communication and open communication using some of the features, and also how to track the progress of the task. So this webinar basically focuses on the development, development part. The part 2 and part 3 of the webinar would talk about how to scale up your agile teams and have requirements, formal requirements management, and also how to include a formal testing process in the agile framework, and how to scale up your agile teams. So this is all about today's webinar. We are open to questions, and if I'm not able to answer all the questions, we'll follow up with you personally, and I'll be happy to do a one-on-one demo or one-on-one talk on any of these topics as well.
So Vinny, the message to everyone, feel free to send in your questions on the question tab. We do have lots of questions coming in. The first one is, what happens when a user story is not completed in a single sprint?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question. So as I mentioned earlier, that once we are populating the sprints, so I'll tell you based on our experience. So when we started adopting the agile methodology, we used to populate the sprint workloads, and then we towards the end of the sprint we realized that okay, these are the 2 user stories that we're not able to implement. Then what we used to do is make a copy of that user story, move it from one sprint to another sprint. So that's why we adopted this approach of breaking down the user story into tasks. So now the benefit is that let's say there is a user story, it has 5 tasks to be completed in order to complete the user story. Now in a specific sprint, only if 3 tasks are complete, so at least half of, or I would say at least the 75% of the user story has been complete. For the 2 tasks that have not been completed, then easily those 2 tasks can be moved into a different sprint, and then the remaining 2 tasks can also be implemented. So our tool, what we do is, we have a sprint, we have a user story. We assign all the 5 tasks in sprint 1, and then when we move the 2 user story to a different sprint, then the same user story is automatically linked or copied, so that even though there are 2 different user stories, but the content is the same, so that developers and the QA don't really lose any context.
Oh, thank you, Vineet. Another question is, can the story points be different from task points?
Yeah, the story points can be different from the task points as well. At TechExcel, we adopt a different approach, as I mentioned. We have a story point concept to just define the size of the story, and then for the tasks, we actually use the task hours. But that's just our method, and I also mentioned the reasons for that. But we understand that there are some teams who would prefer using a task points as well. So in the diff track tool itself, you can define a different set of story points and a different set of task points as well, just in case if you want to estimate your task in terms of points versus in terms of hours.
Okay. And another question is, do you pre-populate all the sprints?
Right. Okay, that's another good question. So when we started to conduct our release planning meeting, so initially we started to populate at least 3 or 4 sprints in advance. But then we realized that just pre-populating doesn't help, because there could be conditions or there could be scenarios wherein we had to pull out in fact some of the features, committed features from sprint 1 and then assign it to sprint 2. So that used to actually, mess up our scheduling, and also, basically the sprint workloads were not accurate for the following sprints. So then now, as a practice, we adopt that we have a sprint we have a release backlog. At one time, we only populate one particular sprint, and then based on the performance of the past sprint, we populate the next remaining sprints, so that it really helps us to understand, where we are in the entire release cycle and how much we can implement.
Right, I see. Okay, here's another one. If user stories planned to be covered in a particular sprint are incomplete, doesn't that imply a sprint failure?
So, as I mentioned, once you define a user story, the user story could have multiple elements in it. So by elements, I mean that it could have multiple tasks in it. So let's say there are 5 tasks that need to be completed in order for a user story. Let me take a more concrete example. We are developing a new sign-up feature for a new product. Now the sign-up feature needs to be implemented for a Windows development, for a web development. So that would be one task. Also need to be implemented for a mobile development. That's another task, and also needs documentation so that that feature can be included in the in the user guides as well. So let's say in the first release, in the first sprint, we have all these 3 tasks assigned, but only web development is complete, and also mobile development is complete, but the documentation task is not complete. So at least you can close those 2 tasks in the sprint 1 because those are really complete, and then just have the remaining task in the documentation task as part of the next sprint as well. So after the sprint number 2, your story will then be complete.
Thank you, Vineet. I want to thank Vineet. Thank you for your time today, and I want to especially thank all of you who attended. And as we mentioned, we will send out a link to this recording as well as a white paper on this with best practices. And if you do want a copy of the slides, please let me know, and I'd be happy to send those. I didn't have them ahead of time to send you, though some people did ask. And if we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with you to get to your question. And one question that just had come in about what are the dates for the second and third webinar in our series. That's a great question, and I appreciate it. We will be sending an email when we send your link to the white paper and to the recording. You'll then have the link to the next dates. They are looking around the first week of September. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your time. And please feel free to reach out to Vineet at DevSuitePM on Twitter if you have anything else. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.